Settle in, close your eyes if you like, and let your mind drift back across the centuries to a warm evening on the southern edge of Europe, where a great limestone rock rises out of the sea at the point where the Atlantic Ocean quietly gives way to the Mediterranean, and where for hundreds of years the fate of empires seemed to turn on the simple fact that whoever controlled that narrow strip of water controlled one of the most important crossings on the entire planet. And it was for exactly that reason that a small, rugged peninsula barely a few miles wide became the setting for one of the longest and most remarkable sieges in the history of the modern world. A siege that would stretch on for nearly 4 full years and would test the patience, the ingenuity, and the endurance of everyone who lived through it. By the late 1770s, the British had already held Gibraltar for about 70 years. Having taken it early in the century and secured it through international treaties that Spain had never fully accepted in its heart, since for the Spanish crown the loss of that rock remained an old and quietly painful wound. And when Spain finally joined France in supporting the American colonies in their struggle for independence, the leaders in Madrid saw in that alliance a long-awaited chance to finally take back what they still considered rightfully theirs. And so almost as soon as war was declared, thousands of Spanish and French soldiers began moving toward the narrow strip of land that connected the rock to the mainland, digging trenches, raising batteries, and preparing for what many of them expected would be a fairly short and decisive campaign. The man responsible for defending that rock through whatever was coming was a British general named George Augustus Eliot, a quiet, disciplined, almost monk-like figure who ate very little meat, drank almost no wine, and pushed his own body through routines of endurance that most of his soldiers could barely imagine keeping up with themselves. And it was exactly that kind of steady, almost unshakable personal discipline that would end up shaping the character of the entire garrison over the long ordeal that lay ahead of them, because a fortress, in the end, only holds as long as the people inside it are willing to hold it, and Eliot seemed determined to hold his for as long as it took. The first months passed in a strange, watchful calm, the kind of quiet that settles over two sides who both sense that something much larger is coming but are still circling each other, testing the ground, before the real storm begins. And while Spanish engineers kept strengthening their lines on the isthmus, the soldiers and townspeople up on the rock spent those early weeks stockpiling what supplies they could, repairing old walls, and settling into the slow, steady rhythm of a life that everyone quietly understood was about to become very difficult indeed. Little by little, ships bringing food and gunpowder found it harder and harder to slip past the Spanish patrols gathering in the bay, and as the blockade tightened, week by week, month by month, both sides began to realize, almost at the same time, that neither of them had truly understood how long this was going to take, because sieges of this kind are rarely won by the side with more cannons or more soldiers. They are won, in the end, by whichever side can simply endure the hunger, the fear, and the endless waiting a little longer than the other, and that quiet, grinding truth would come to define almost everything that happened on that rock over the 4 long years that followed. As that first winter settled in, the ordinary families of Gibraltar, the bakers, the fishermen, the shopkeepers who had never asked to be part of any war, began to feel the blockade press in on their daily lives in ways that were impossible to ignore. Prices for the simplest foods climbed higher than anyone could remember, and more than a few households found themselves quietly frightened by how little was left in their stores. Yet somehow, through the strict rationing that General Eliot insisted on and the steady, careful way the garrison shared out what little it had, the town held together through those first hard months, even as everyone on the rock understood, without needing to say it aloud, that everything from here on would depend entirely on whether the ships of the Royal Navy could keep finding their way through. As the weeks folded into months and the blockade tightened its grip a little more each season, it slowly became clear to everyone on the rock that ordinary walls and ordinary courage were not going to be enough on their own, and that the small garrison would need to find some clever way to make up for the sheer size of the army gathered against them, because the enemy guns kept multiplying along the shore. And before long, shells were falling somewhere on the fortress almost every single day, forcing soldiers and families alike to spend more and more of their lives underground, tucked into the natural caves and hollows that had always existed quietly inside the soft limestone of the rock itself. That particular kind of stone turned out to matter more than anyone could have guessed at first, because unlike hard granite or solid slate, Gibraltar's limestone was soft enough to be worked by hand, and it did not take long for the garrison's engineers to notice that their ordinary above-ground defenses were painfully exposed in certain places, especially along the tall northern face of the rock, where the cliff dropped away so steeply that no cannon could ever be set up there to answer the batteries the Spanish kept building on the higher ground across the way. It was exactly that one narrow, practical problem, and not some grand master plan laid out from the very beginning, that quietly gave birth to one of the strangest and most wonderful engineering stories of the whole siege, when a sergeant major of the Royal Engineers named Ince came forward with a fairly bold idea, that instead of trying to somehow build guns onto an impossible cliff face, the garrison could simply carve a passage straight into the rock itself, a hidden gallery from which cannons could fire out at angles the enemy had never imagined possible, safe from any shell that came flying back in return. Work began with nothing more than picks, crowbars, chisels, and small charges of gunpowder, since there was no special mining equipment of any kind waiting on that isolated rock, and soldiers who had never dug anything harder than a garden trench in their lives found themselves chipping away at solid stone for hour after hour, sometimes advancing only a few inches in an entire day of exhausting, dusty, back-breaking labor, all while still standing their regular watches and ducking for cover whenever the shelling picked up again outside. Yet somehow, through all of that grinding difficulty, the tunnel kept growing, and it did not take long before the engineers realized that Sergeant Major Ince's modest idea for one single gun gallery could be stretched into something far larger and far more ambitious, a whole hidden network of passages threading through the rock, linking one defensive position to another so that soldiers, ammunition, and precious food could move from place to place completely shielded from enemy fire, an idea that felt almost unheard of for its time, since no other fortress in Europe had ever tried to hide quite this much of itself inside its own bedrock. Each new gallery that opened up seemed to solve 2 or 3 problems at once, offering a safe firing position, a sheltered place to wait out the worst of the bombardment, a hidden route for moving reinforcements exactly where they were needed, and even a dry, protected room for storing whatever food and powder the garrison had left. And the small vents that were first cut simply to let out gunpowder smoke after blasting soon became narrow firing slits of their own, capable of surprising an advancing enemy from an angle nobody would have thought to expect. General Elliot, watching all of this unfold, understood almost immediately what a gift it was, and he pushed his engineers and his soldiers to keep widening and extending the tunnels for as long as the siege continued, and slowly, quietly, month after month, that great rock stopped being simply a natural wall standing between the garrison and its enemies, and became something stranger and far more remarkable. A fortress with a second, hidden life running through its very bones, offering the defenders a kind of freedom of movement and protection that nobody outside on the plain below could have ever guessed was there. While the soldiers kept quietly chipping their way deeper into the rock, ordinary life on the surface, for soldier and townsperson alike, kept bending itself around the harsh rhythm of the blockade, and food remained the hardest problem of all, because even though British ships did manage, every so often, to slip past the Spanish patrols and bring in a fresh convoy, the gaps between those precious arrivals often stretched on for many long months, during which everyone on the rock had to make do with salted meat, hard biscuit, and whatever small store of grain still remained in the warehouses. One of the cruelest hardships that crept in during those long gaps was scurvy, that quiet, wasting sickness that comes from going too long without any fresh fruit or vegetables. And as the months of the blockade dragged on, more and more soldiers and townspeople began to notice their gums bleeding, their teeth loosening, and their whole bodies growing weaker and slower to heal, and the doctors of that era, who understood so little about what actually caused the illness, could do almost nothing to stop it from spreading until the next convoy finally arrived carrying lemons and oranges, at which point the sickness would slowly begin to ease, only to creep back again once those fresh supplies had once more run out. Beyond hunger and sickness, the people of Gibraltar also lived under the constant, unpredictable threat of the bombardment itself, which rose and fell in intensity depending on the season, but at its worst could tear entire streets apart in a single afternoon, and many families found themselves forced out of homes that had stood for generations, moving instead into whatever sheltered corner of the rock they could find, while a fortunate few who had the means to leave altogether chose to sail away to safer places at the very start of the siege, leaving behind neighbors who, for one reason or another, had no such choice and simply had to endure whatever was coming alongside the garrison that was sworn to protect them. And yet, even inside all of that hardship, a strange and resourceful kind of daily life slowly took shape on the rock, as merchants who still had a little stock left began charging astonishing prices for the most ordinary goods, giving rise to a quiet, unofficial trade in everything from flour to medicine. And while the British officers tried again and again to regulate this improvised market and keep prices fair, there was really no way to stamp out that kind of quiet bargaining entirely once. Nearly everything worth having had become scarce. Through it all, General Elliot kept discipline remarkably tight, punishing looting or neglect of duty severely, since he seemed to believe, and many of his officers came to agree, that in a siege this long, it was steady order and a shared sense of purpose that kept a garrison whole, and his own famously simple, almost Spartan way of living, eating little, drinking less, and pushing his body harder than men half his age, gave his soldiers a quiet kind of example to hold on to whenever the future looked most uncertain. And all the while, deep inside the rock, the tunnels kept growing, gallery by gallery, as the engineers learned clever tricks for letting fresh air flow naturally through the passages, easing the burden on the men working underground and turning some of the earliest, roughest tunnels into proper storerooms and shelters, safe from anything the enemy could throw at them, so that little by little, without anyone quite planning it that way from the start, Gibraltar was becoming something the world had simply never seen before, a fortress with an entire secret world hidden beneath its familiar face, a hidden world that would, before very long, prove itself in the fiercest battle of the whole long siege. By the turn of the new decade, it had become plain to everyone involved that whatever quick victory Spain had once imagined back at the very start of the war was simply never going to arrive, and the siege, once expected to last a few busy months at most, had settled instead into a long, grinding contest of patience and resources that neither side seemed able to bring to a swift close. No matter how many new batteries the Spanish engineers raised along the shore or how tightly their ships tried to seal off the bay. One of the most important turning points of those early years came from the sea itself, in the form of a daring relief expedition led by a British admiral named George Rodney, who in the first days of the new year led a convoy of desperately needed supplies toward the rock, and along the way ran into a Spanish fleet that he engaged and defeated in a night battle so vivid under the moonlight that it would forever after be remembered simply as the Moonlight Battle, a victory that not only allowed his ships to slip safely into Gibraltar's harbor with their precious cargo, but also quietly shook the confidence of the Spanish command, who were forced to admit that keeping total control of the surrounding sea, the one thing their whole plan depended on, was proving far harder than anyone in Madrid had ever expected. For a little while after Rodney's convoy arrived, life on the rock felt almost bearable again, as fresh food, medicine, and gunpowder were finally shared out among a garrison and a townspeople that had grown thin and weary from months of rationing, and battered buildings were patched up wherever hands and materials could be spared. Yet everyone understood, even in that welcome moment of relief, that the respite would not last, and that the guns across the water would sooner or later begin their work again in earnest. And indeed, within a matter of months the blockade tightened once more, and the Spanish and French commanders, still convinced that Gibraltar had to fall if the whole war effort was to mean anything, began quietly drawing up plans for a far larger and more decisive assault, one meant to finally bring this stubborn, unyielding siege to an end once and for all, whatever the cost. Over the 2 long years that followed, the fighting rose and fell in waves, sometimes flaring into fierce exchanges of cannon fire, sometimes settling into weeks of watchful, uneasy quiet, and through it all the garrison kept holding, leaning more and more on that hidden network of tunnels that had, by this point, grown into a truly remarkable maze of galleries linking one part of the rock to another, letting soldiers move safely from place to place no matter how heavy the shelling grew. Outside, meanwhile, far beyond Gibraltar, on other fronts of that same wider war for American independence, events were slowly tilting in ways that put growing pressure on the Allied Spanish and French commanders, who could feel all of Europe watching to see whether they could finally deliver the one clear victory that this long, stubborn siege still owed them. And it was that mounting pressure, more than anything else, that finally pushed them toward an extraordinary and untested idea: the construction of specially reinforced floating batteries, ships rebuilt with thick layers of soaked, fire-resistant timber and armed with heavy guns, designed to sail in close to the fortress walls and pound them into submission while remaining, or so their engineers firmly believed, almost completely immune to anything the defenders could fire back in return. By the autumn of that pivotal year, everything was finally in place for what both sides understood would be the decisive moment of the entire long siege, as the combined Spanish and French forces gathered around Gibraltar in numbers the small garrison could never hope to match, bringing together their land batteries, their warships, and, at the very center of the plan, those newly built floating batteries designed specifically to break through defenses that had already withstood 3 long years of ordinary bombardment. On a September morning, 10 of those specially built vessels moved into position, supported by the full weight of the land artillery and the combined fleet, and opened a bombardment more intense than anything the defenders had ever experienced, a storm of iron that thundered on for hour after hour, and for a while it truly seemed as though the fortress might finally be overwhelmed, since the floating batteries proved just as sturdy as their builders had promised, shrugging off shot after shot that would have shattered an ordinary warship in minutes. But General Elliot and his gunners had spent a long time quietly preparing for exactly this moment, and now they turned to a method they had readied in advance, heating solid cannonballs until they glowed red in portable furnaces set up right along the walls, and firing those glowing shots directly into the wooden hulls of the enemy's ships, and slowly, As the bombardment wore on, small fires began to catch inside those hulls. Fires that no amount of careful engineering could fully guard against. Spreading quietly through timber that had been built strong enough to stop a cannonball but never quite strong enough to stop a flame. As the fires spread from one vessel to the next, a quiet panic began to take hold among the crews trapped aboard, since escaping a burning ship in the middle of a raging battle was a desperately dangerous thing to attempt, and by the time night fell and the following morning arrived, most of the great floating batteries had been consumed by fire, several of them finally exploding as the flames reached their stores of gunpowder, leaving behind heavy losses among the men who had sailed out that morning so certain of victory. That single, extraordinary battle, remembered ever since as the Grand Assault, marked the true turning point of the whole siege, proving beyond any doubt that the fortress could not be broken by clever engineering and heavy guns alone, and in a moment that many who witnessed it never forgot, British sailors and soldiers turned from the smoke and wreckage to help pull surviving enemy sailors from the burning water. Even as the battle still raged around them, an act of quiet decency that stood in gentle contrast to the terrible violence of everything that had come before it that long, fiery night. The defeat of the floating batteries left the combined Spanish and French forces not only badly weakened in ships and men, but also deeply shaken in spirit, since it had become impossible now to avoid the plain and uncomfortable truth that taking Gibraltar by direct assault, no matter how clever or how costly the attempt, simply lay beyond their reach, and that realization, more than any single treaty or negotiation that followed, quietly settled the final course of the siege from that night onward. In the months that followed that fiery, decisive night, the pace of the siege slowly began to ease, even though the blockade itself technically continued until the wider war finally came to its official end, since the Spanish and French commanders, having lost so much in the failed assault, found themselves forced to set aside any hope of a swift, dramatic victory and settle instead into the quieter, grinding hope that simple exhaustion might eventually force the garrison to surrender without the need for another costly attack. Meanwhile, the British command, understanding just how much still hung on holding that rock through to the peace talks, organized one more vital relief mission, entrusting it to an admiral named Richard Howe, whose fleet set out that October to break through the lingering blockade and deliver fresh food, medicine, and powder to a garrison that had been stretched painfully thin by years of rationing. And although Howe's convoy ran into stiff resistance from the combined enemy fleet along the way, clever seamanship and more than a little good fortune allowed most of his ships to slip safely into the harbor, giving the defenders one final, much-needed lift as the siege moved toward its close. The safe arrival of Howe's convoy marked, in its own quiet way, the true beginning of the end, since it had become perfectly clear by now that no blockade, however determined, could truly seal off the rock forever, and that a garrison kept alive by even occasional supply runs could go on holding out almost indefinitely so long as its discipline and its will remained intact, and that simple, stubborn truth, together with shifting fortunes on other fronts of the wider war, slowly nudged every side involved toward the idea that some kind of peaceful settlement was now the only sensible way forward. Through the months that followed, the bombardment continued at a steady, familiar pace, but nothing on the scale of that terrible September night was ever attempted again, as both sides seemed to quietly accept that further attacks of that kind would achieve little against a fortress so thoroughly protected by its underground galleries, which by now formed a truly vast hidden world beneath the rock, sheltering soldiers from almost anything the enemy could still bring to bear against them. The ordinary people of the town, having endured more than 3 years of hardship by this point, slowly began to feel a certain cautious relief creep in as word spread of peace talks underway among the warring powers, even though nothing official had yet been announced, and daily life on the rock continued in that strange, suspended way that comes when an ending feels close but has not quite arrived, while the doctors of the garrison, who had spent years treating scurvy, exhaustion, and the many illnesses born of crowded, hungry living, kept doing everything within their limited power to ease the suffering that still lingered among both soldiers and townspeople alike. And even as those quiet talks moved slowly forward far away in Europe, the engineers up on the rock kept right on widening their tunnels and adding new galleries, a small but telling sign that the defenders of Gibraltar were not yet willing to place their full trust in diplomacy alone, preferring instead to stay ready for whatever might still come, even as the prospect of a final, peaceful end to the long siege grew steadily more certain with each passing week of negotiation. The talks meant to finally bring the wider war to a close stretched on for several more months, as representatives of Britain, France, Spain, and the young United States worked through the many difficult questions still standing between them and a lasting peace, and the fate of Gibraltar remained one of the thorniest of all, since the Spanish delegation, despite everything that had happened, still pressed hard for the rock to be returned to Spanish hands, regarding the matter as a question of national pride too important to simply let go. But the British negotiators, keenly aware of just how much strategic value lay in holding that narrow gateway between two great seas, refused outright to even consider handing Gibraltar back, offering instead various other territories and concessions in its place, and after long, careful, sometimes tense negotiation, the parties finally settled on a compromise, recorded in the Treaty of Paris of 1783, under which Gibraltar remained firmly under British rule while Spain received other lands in return, including the return of Florida and the island of Minorca. The formal end of a siege that had stretched on for nearly 3 years and 8 months, making it one of the longest such sieges in modern European history, was met by the defenders of the rock with a deep and quiet relief, mixed with a real sense of pride at having endured so much for so long without ever giving way, and General Elliot, whose name had by now become known across Europe as a symbol of that stubborn, patient defense, received the honors due to him, including a noble title that fittingly marked just how highly his role in holding the rock was regarded. With the blockade finally lifted, the townspeople could at last begin returning to something resembling ordinary life, after years of hunger, sickness, and the constant threat of falling shells that had torn apart so much of their town. And although rebuilding what had been damaged took a good deal of time, the simple fact that the long siege had ended at all brought with it a sense of victory that reached far beyond the purely military. A quiet triumph of endurance and cleverness over an enemy that had, for a time, seemed impossible to withstand. Historians who studied this remarkable episode in the years that followed generally agreed that a handful of key factors had made the difference. The strict and steady discipline General Elliot had instilled from the very first days, the occasional but crucial supply convoys that kept slipping through the blockade at just the right moments, and running quietly beneath everything else, that extraordinary tunnel system, carved by hand through solid rock, which had let the garrison shelter from the worst of the bombardment, and kept its losses far lower than anyone watching from the outside could ever have guessed. The tunnels themselves, born out of nothing more than a single practical problem and a soldier's clever idea, turned out to matter so much in the end that the garrison kept widening and improving them for decades after the siege had ended, gradually turning what had begun as a handful of narrow galleries into one of the most remarkable feats of military engineering in the history of Europe. A hidden achievement that would go on to make this long, quiet siege one of the most studied and most admired stories of resilience and resourcefulness from that entire era of history. Decades after the guns finally fell silent, that same tunnel system, first carved for one small, urgent purpose in the middle of a desperate siege, kept growing and changing with the years, and later, in the 20th century, during still another great conflict, engineers expanded it even further, until an entire hidden world took shape beneath the rock, complete with hospitals, storerooms, and even its own small power station, all quietly waiting inside the stone in case they were ever needed again. Yet it is still those very first galleries, the ones dug by hand with nothing more than picks, crowbars, and gunpowder over 4 long, difficult years, that remain the most touching reminder of everything the defenders of Gibraltar managed to endure and to build, and the surviving stretches of that original tunnel system, now known simply as the Great Siege Tunnels, have gone on to become one of the most visited and most cherished landmarks anywhere on that rock, drawing travelers from all over the world who want to walk, if only for an afternoon, through the same quiet passages once carved by exhausted, determined hands. The story of that long siege reaches, in the end, far beyond the guns and the walls, since the whole remarkable episode quietly showed the world just how much a clever use of ordinary ground, ordinary stone, and ordinary human patience could accomplish even against an enemy with every apparent advantage. And the lesson of those glowing cannonballs fired into the floating batteries on that one decisive night has been studied ever since as a gentle reminder that the simplest solution, applied with courage and precision, can sometimes undo even the most impressive of new inventions. General Elliot himself, whose quiet, disciplined example steadied his garrison through years of hunger and uncertainty, remains a figure historians return to again and again, not for any single dramatic act but for the slow, steady, everyday leadership that somehow kept an entire community holding together through nearly 4 years that might so easily have broken it apart, a reminder that endurance, more often than not, is built from small, patient choices repeated day after day rather than from any single moment of glory. And the ordinary people of Gibraltar, who never asked to spend years of their lives sharing hunger and fear and the endless threat of falling shells with their garrison, deserve to be remembered too, since every great siege, however it is told afterward, is always in the end a story about ordinary families finding a way to keep living, keep hoping, and keep caring for one another through years that asked more of them than anyone should ever really have to give. And so tonight, as you drift off to sleep, let your thoughts settle gently on that quiet rock rising from the sea, its hidden tunnels resting silent in the dark, its long ordeal finally over, its people safe at last, and let the story of all that patient endurance, all that quiet ingenuity, carry you softly into your own peaceful rest, the way the sea itself has always settled, slowly and gently, against the base of that old and unshakable stone.